want to go home! Take me home!
That night, the ocean seemed not just water, but thick black tar that absorbed all light. Waves crashed with a dull thud against the wooden sides of the whaling ship, carrying the sound into the endless void. William lay on his bunk in pitch darkness, listening to the unusual silence on the upper deck. Usually, the ship breathed with the creaking of rigging and the footsteps of the watchman, but now that harmony had been rudely disrupted. At that moment, he did not yet realize that he was alone. Samuel Comstock, the chief harpooner and instigator of this nightmare, stood over the dead with a completely blank stare. No one heard his cry when he struck the first blows. Everything happened in frightening silence. William looked at the rebels' bloodied hands and realized that his former world had collapsed overnight. He still believed that this was temporary, but time was already working against him. William began to understand that no help would come from any of the living. The most frightening thing about that night was not the bloodshed or the pain. The most frightening thing was the silence. He did not know that this was only the beginning of a long journey into the heart of human madness. He was left alone with the cold. At that moment, everything depended solely on him and his ability to stay sane. He did not yet know how many days he would have to spend alone among the crazed crowd. From that moment on, he was no longer an explorer. He became a survivor. No one had prepared him for loneliness. He kept going because stopping meant dying right here and now. With each passing day, the hope of rescue would become thinner and thinner. He was not afraid of death. He was afraid of not being found. They did not know it yet, but at that moment, they ceased to be explorers and became survivors. The world continued to live its busy life, trading and making ambitious plans for the future. But for the crew of the whaling ship, time stopped on the day they left their home port. William began to speak aloud, standing at the rail, simply to hear a human voice amid the roar of the ocean. He quickly realized that the most dangerous thing about a long voyage was not storms, but despair. He no longer counted the days. He counted the chances of a successful return home with holds full of precious whale blubber. On that first night after departure, he did not know if he would survive the expedition. At first, no one wanted to voice their doubts about the route chosen by the captain. They still believed that salvation in the form of a good catch would soon come, but everyone understood that the situation was slowly deteriorating. When the ship approached the cold latitudes, the weather changed dramatically, revealing the cruel nature of the ocean. The temperature dropped so rapidly that breath turned into steam, instantly settling as ice on the rigging. The icy air burned their lungs, causing the sailors to choke with every careless deep breath. Numb hands barely held the heavy ropes as the men tried to control the sails in the wind. The ice forming on the deck turned every movement into a deadly test of balance. Some of the senior sailors already understood how this risky passage through the southern seas would end. They looked at each other and saw the fear hidden behind their weather-beaten faces and thick beards. The crew began to crack under the pressure of constant cold and hard physical labor. No one wanted to take responsibility for a possible mutiny or open disobedience. The captain still remained calm. But this calm did not last long, as there was almost no catch and fatigue was mounting. They were separated not only by the icy desert of the ocean, but also by deep doubts about the success of the venture. At that moment, they slowly ceased to be a united team with a common goal. They began to blame each other for failures, noticing the slightest mistakes during watches. The most dangerous enemy was not the storm, but growing mistrust. The cold united them during the day while they worked and mercilessly divided them at night in the cabin. They still called it a simple delay in fishing, but it was already a real trap. From that day on, the usual expedition was over. A slow, exhausting struggle for survival began. Some sailors were already mentally saying goodbye to home as they gazed into the endless blue. They still acted as a crew obeying orders, but they already thought like doomed men. The question was not whether all the members of this ill-fated whaling expedition would survive. The question was who would be the last to remain on this cursed floating piece of wood. It was at that very moment that everything changed forever. The story of the bloody mutiny had already begun to unfold. The ocean around them was endless, depriving them of any chance of reaching solid ground. A long journey awaited them, and many subconsciously understood that not all of them would make it to the end. The tension grew with every mile, bringing the inevitable denouement of this maritime drama closer. They were heading into the unknown, driven by someone else's will and their own despair, and nature watched impassively as they approached the edge of the abyss.
We'll ride this out.
There was no turning back when Samuel Comstock made the final decision to take power into his own hands. None of them yet understood the scale of what was happening on that fateful January night. They still hoped that the violence would be limited to a few blows and threats. But false hope never changes the harsh reality of what is happening. The world was too far away to intervene and stop this madness. Help could have come in theory, but in practice, the vast ocean made it impossible. Or maybe not, because only the murdered captain knew the ship's route. That day marked the beginning of their descent into the deepest abyss of the human spirit. It was not the end, but only the beginning of the real test of their lives. From that moment on, time became their main and most ruthless enemy. Nature made no distinction between the righteous and the murderers, washing the blood from the deck with rain. Everything was decided here and now, under the dim light of swaying oil lamps. A long journey to land awaited them, and not all would make it to the end. The mutineers threw the officers' bodies overboard, leaving them to be torn apart by sea predators. William watched in a daze, feeling his own soul freeze. Their surroundings had turned into a closed prison of wood and canvas, floating on endless water. The physical condition of the survivors deteriorated due to constant stress and chronic lack of normal sleep. The decision to submit to the mutineers was the only way to save his life that night. The consequence of this choice was complicity in a crime that could no longer be washed away. The situation worsened with each passing hour as the ship strayed further and further from its usual course. Comstock declared himself the new captain, demanding absolute loyalty from every member of the crew. He established new, bloody laws, the violation of which was punishable by immediate death without trial. People moved across the deck like ghosts, afraid to make a sound or look each other in the eye. The creaking of breaking ice in their memories was replaced by the sound of musket triggers being cocked. Silence became their constant companion, full of unspoken horror and pain. Exhausted by insomnia, the sailors flinched at the slightest rustle, expecting a blow to the back. Their hands trembled with weakness as they tried to perform their usual work with the sails. The empty horizon around the ship only intensified the feeling of complete isolation from the rest of humanity. The endless ice of their fear bound their will more tightly than any metal chains. Isolation penetrated their skin, poisoning their minds with the venom of paranoia. No one believed anymore in the possibility of a happy outcome to this cursed voyage. Each day brought only new threats and demonstrations of the new commander's insane power. William tried to become invisible, to dissolve into the shadows of the ship's superstructure and holds. He carried out orders mechanically, shutting off all emotion so as not to reveal his true state. It was the only way to survive in a place where human life had lost all value. Comstock planned to sail to uninhabited islands and create his own sovereign state there. This insane idea frightened the crew even more than the brutal murders they had committed. They understood that in this new state, they would be destined to become powerless slaves. Those who disagreed disappeared at night, their cries quickly drowned out by the sound of the rolling ocean waves. The ship turned into a floating slaughterhouse, controlled by a madman. One day in the clear sky, they saw a strange cloud shaped like a balloon. It was an optical illusion, a cruel joke played by a weary mind seeking salvation in the heavens. But there could be no balloons here, only the scorching sun and endless water. This mirage only emphasized the depth of their despair and isolation from the civilized world. Hope flared up for a second and died, leaving only bitter ashes behind. The ocean continued to rock the ship indifferently on its mighty dark blue waves. It did not care who was at the helm or whose blood was spilled on the deck. This monumental indifference of the elements weighed on the psyche more heavily than the threats of the mutineers. People were left to their own devices in a vast emptiness where the laws of morality ceased to exist. And in this emptiness, slowly but surely, a new, even more terrifying cycle of violence was beginning. The ship moved toward the Marshall Islands, driven by steady trade winds and the will of its crazed leader. The sun beat down mercilessly from the sky, turning the wooden deck into a hot frying pan. There was no salvation in the shade, and the stifling air enveloped their bodies in a sticky film of sweat and dirt. Exhaustion became a familiar state, dulling their sense of danger and instinct for self-preservation. People moved like sleepwalkers, carrying out orders on autopilot. Fresh water supplies were rapidly dwindling, and thirst was beginning to drive people mad. Lips cracked until they bled, and tongues swelled, making any attempt to speak incredibly painful. William looked at the endless expanse of water and understood the irony of their situation. They were dying of thirst, surrounded by millions of gallons of undrinkable water. Their weakened bodies trembled with fever, despite the unbearable tropical heat. The crew's physical weakness reached a critical point when true scurvy set in. Their gums bled, their teeth loosened, and dark, unhealing sores appeared on their skin. Hallucinations became commonplace. Sailors saw land where there was none. One of them jumped overboard, shouting that he could see the green meadows of his homeland. The ocean silently embraced him, closing the waves over the madman's head. William felt his own strength slipping away like sand through his fingers. Every climb up the rigging required tremendous effort, accompanied by the risk of falling down. He closed his eyes and saw his native shore before him, but the vision quickly faded. The surrounding world had shrunk to the size of the wooden hull of the whaling ship. The physical condition of the people resembled that of the living dead, deprived of hope. The decision to save the meager remains of food only brought the crew closer to mass exhaustion. The result was a loss of humanity and a willingness to go to any extremes. The situation worsened steadily, leaving no chance for a miraculous escape. Rats infested the holds and became bold due to the lack of resistance from the humans. They ran openly across the deck, stealing pitiful crumbs of food right from under the noses of the weakened sailors. Some tried to catch them to somehow satisfy the hunger gnawing at their stomachs. The nights brought a cold wind that chilled their exhausted bodies to the bone. It was not the piercing frost of the polar latitudes, but it was just as deadly. Weakness prevented them from warming themselves, and they lay huddled together, pressed close to one another. The silence was broken only by the moans of the sick and the creaking of wood dried out by the heat. No one knew whether the next dawn would bring salvation or final destruction. The loneliness of each individual in this crowd of doomed people was absolute. William looked at the stars, trying to find some hidden meaning in what was happening. But the stars were cold and infinitely distant from human suffering. They shone with an even light, illuminating the path to nowhere for the ghost ship. The trap had snapped shut and escape seemed an impossible myth. The appearance of land on the horizon did not bring joy, but only a new wave of heavy anxiety. It was the Mili Atoll, a ring of coral islands surrounded by treacherous underwater reefs. Comstock ordered the ship to head for the shore, intending to establish his insane kingdom there. The landing was chaotic, with people falling from exhaustion right into the warm coastal waves. The sand seemed not like salvation, but only a new stage for the bloody drama that was unfolding. The island greeted them with dense thickets and the deceptive, frightening silence of the tropical forest. The surroundings seemed like paradise, but for the exhausted sailors, they harbored unknown threats. The physical condition of the crew did not allow them to set up a proper and safe camp. The decision to bring all the supplies ashore proved fatal for the further development of events. The result was complete dependence on the land and the loss of the opportunity to escape quickly. Having lost their leader, the remaining crew members plunged into chaos and brutal internal strife. They ate the flesh of their slain comrades to prolong their own miserable lives. It was the final fall into an abyss from which no one returns the same. William watched this degradation with horror, hiding in the thick jungle undergrowth. He preferred to eat roots and rare berries just so he wouldn't have to touch the cursed meat. His mind teetered on the brink of madness from the nightmare he had witnessed. The local tribes, watching the newcomers from their hiding places, soon decided to intervene. They realized that the strangers were weakened by internal conflicts and no longer posed a serious threat. The attack was swift and merciless, like a typhoon striking the ocean. Spears and clubs rained down on the heads of the sailors, who had been driven mad by bloodlust. Nature, through the hands of the natives, cleansed its island of the filth that had been brought there. The massacre did not last long, as the resistance of the exhausted men was minimal. Almost all of the surviving crew members were brutally killed right on the beach. The white sand turned red, repeating the scene on the deck of the whaling ship. William and another young sailor were captured by the natives but left alive. They were spared because of their youth and turned into slaves of the local chief. Their surroundings changed to a primitive existence, full of hard physical labor. William's physical condition improved thanks to regular food, but his soul was dead. The decision to submit to the will of the savages was the only chance to keep breathing. The result was a long life in isolation among a foreign, incomprehensible culture. The deterioration of the situation stopped, giving way to a monotonous and hopeless wait for the end. The ocean still crashed against the reefs, surrounding the atoll with an impenetrable wall of foam. It did not try to kill the captives. It simply hid them securely from the rest of the world. Days turned into months, and months slowly turned into years of emptiness. No one knew that two young men were still alive on this lost piece of land. They became ghosts, erased from the memory of humanity. Life among the natives turned into a series of identical, exhausting days. He did the hardest work, hauling stones and chopping trees under the scorching sun. His hands were covered with calluses, and his skin had turned the color of burnt brick from constant sun exposure. The once proud sailor's gaze had dimmed, expressing only immense fatigue and humility. At night, he lay on a mat, listening to the sounds of the jungle beyond the thin walls of the hut. During these hours, the nightmares of the tragedy he had experienced on the ship returned to him. He saw again the blood-stained deck and the mad eyes of Samuel Comstock. He woke up in a cold sweat, suffocating from the invisible grip of past horror. There was no escape from these visions, either in reality or in dreams. Sometimes he would go ashore and stare at the empty horizon for hours. He tried to make out the white sail that would bring him freedom and a return home. But the ocean remained clear and indifferent to his silent pleas. The isolation was so complete that at times he doubted the reality of his past life. America seemed to him like a fairy tale, a dream he had once seen. The locals treated them without particular cruelty, but also without pity. For them, white people were simply useful tools with no will of their own. William resigned himself to his role, carrying out orders with the automatism of a machine. He learned not to think about tomorrow, focusing instead on surviving in the present moment. Hope became too painful a feeling to allow himself to experience. During storm season, the ocean showed its true destructive power and might. Huge waves crashed against the reefs, making the ground shake beneath his feet. On days like these, William felt a strange, dark satisfaction from the wrath of the elements. It seemed to him that nature shared his inner pain and rage, but the storm subsided, leaving behind only fallen trees and a damp silence. Time lost its usual count, turning into a viscous, endless substance. He no longer remembered how many years had passed since the day he left his home port. His age was marked only by new scars on his body and gray hair. The world beyond the ocean continued to develop, wage war, and make discoveries. Here on the island, history stood still, like a fly trapped in a drop of amber. Once he found a piece of ship's planking washed up on the shore by the waves. It was a fragment of an old vessel, covered with shells and seaweed. William held the plank in his hands for a long time, feeling the rough surface of the wood. It was physical proof that ships were still being built somewhere out there. But this discovery only brought a sharp flash of pain, reminding him of his hopeless situation. He buried the piece of wood in the sand so he would never see it again. Returning to reality was too much for his exhausted mind. The illusion of resignation to fate offered at least some protection from complete madness. He continued his existence, becoming a living shadow amid the tropical abundance. The island became his home, his prison, and his possible future grave. It was the year 1825 when the island's routine was suddenly disrupted. A white dot appeared on the horizon, quickly growing and taking shape. It was the U.S. military schooner Dolphin, sent to search for survivors after the mutiny. William stood on the shore, not believing his eyes and afraid to blink. It seemed to him that this was another cruel mirage, created by his tired mind. The ship dropped anchor outside the reef, and armed boats were lowered into the water. Sailors in unfamiliar uniforms leaned on their oars, heading for the sandy beach. William's heart was beating so hard that he thought it would break his ribs. He wanted to scream, but only a muffled, hoarse groan escaped his throat. He had forgotten how to call for help in his native language. His surroundings suddenly became unimportant. All his attention was focused on the approaching people. His physical condition faded into the background, adrenaline making him forget his fatigue. The decision to go out to meet the rescuers was made instantly, despite the threat from the natives. The result of this step was a return to a world he thought he had lost forever. When the officer stepped onto the sand, William rushed to him, falling to his knees. He muttered incoherent words of gratitude, mixing English and local phrases. The sailors looked at this emaciated, ragged man with deep compassion and horror. They could hardly recognize him as a member of the crew of the once proud whaling ship. His appearance spoke more eloquently than any words about the suffering he had endured. Once on board, William ate a normal hot meal for the first time in several years, but the food seemed tasteless, and the soft bed did not bring the expected comfort. The noise of the civilized ship weighed on him, causing bouts of inexplicable anxiety. He was unaccustomed to the confined spaces of the cabins and the large number of people around him. His soul still remained there, on the wild shore of the lost atoll. The schooner set sail, leaving Millie Island behind in the haze of the ocean horizon. William stared at the receding strip of land for a long time, feeling a strange, inexplicable longing. This green prison had saved his life, but it had permanently scarred his psyche. He was returning home, but he knew he would never be the same person again. A part of him had been left behind on that bloody sand forever. The voyage to America took several long months, filled with questioning and medical examinations. Officers recorded every word of the survivors, documenting the story of an unprecedented mutiny. William relived the nightmare over and over again, recounting the death of the captain and Comstock's madness. These interrogations were a necessary but extremely painful procedure for his traumatized mind. He wanted to forget it all, but the world demanded details. The ocean, which had been their jailer, now became the road to long-awaited salvation, but it remained as cold and indifferent to the fate of its passengers as ever. Nature did not celebrate their deliverance or mourn their lost comrades. The waters of the Pacific Ocean closed behind the stern, erasing the ship's trail forever. The journey was coming to an end, but the real consequences were just beginning to unfold. The return to the United States did not bring William the peace of mind and joy he had expected. Society greeted them with morbid curiosity, a thirst for sensation and frightening details. The newspapers were full of headlines about bloody mutiny, cannibalism, and the moral decay of the crew. People looked at the survivors as if they were strange beasts brought back from the underworld. This unhealthy interest was worse than outright condemnation. William tried to return to normal life, find a job, and start a family. But the nightmares persisted, causing him to wake up screaming in the dark. The sound of a door slamming reminded him of a musket shot on the deck of a whaling ship. The smell of roasted meat made him nauseous and brought back horrific memories of life on the island. The past held him in a death grip, preventing him from moving forward. He wrote a book about his misadventures, hoping that putting the facts down on paper would help clear his mind. The pages of the manuscript were saturated with his pain, fear, and guilt for having survived. But the publication of the book brought no relief, only increasing attention to his person. Readers sought adventure in it, not understanding the true depth of the tragedy described. Writing proved to be a weak remedy for trauma of such magnitude. The environment in a civilized city seemed false and infinitely fragile to him. His physical condition returned to normal, but his psychological wounds never healed. The decision to live among people required enormous effort and constant self-control. The result was voluntary seclusion and alienation from the joys of ordinary existence. The situation worsened inside his mind, where the ocean continued to rage. The other participants in the mutiny, the few who had managed to escape on the ship, were found. A trial was held, which handed down harsh sentences, sending the guilty to the gallows. Justice prevailed, but it could not bring the dead back to life. William was present at the executions, looking into the empty eyes of his former comrade. The noose around their necks was a logical end for those who had crossed the line of humanity. But even the death of the executioners did not bring a sense of satisfaction or closure. The tragedy of the global rebellion showed how thin the veneer of culture is on humans. In extreme conditions, people quickly forget about morality, turning into cruel beasts. The ocean became the perfect stage for this demonstration of the dark side of human nature. No laws or courts could change this frightening philosophical fact. The years passed, turning William into a frail old man with a heavy, unblinking gaze. He often came to the port and watched the ships sailing away for hours. He knew what awaited the sailors there, beyond the horizon, where there were no witnesses. Behind the snow-white sails, he saw the ghosts of those who had been lost forever in the ice and reefs. The sea was vast, beautiful, and a completely ruthless killer. His story became a legend, a scary tale for young sailors before their first voyage. But for him, it was reality, imprinted on his retinas and brain neurons. He survived mutiny, starvation, slavery, and rescue, but he could never escape himself. His life was destroyed that night when Samuel Comstock picked up the axe. The rest was just a long, drawn-out wait for the inevitable end. Millie Island continued to exist, washed by the warm waves of the Pacific Ocean. The white sand had long since hidden any traces of the bloody massacre that had taken place there. Nature had healed its wounds, restoring the perfect picture of a tropical paradise. Only somewhere deep in the thickets did a piece of wood from a broken boat remain to rot. The world moved on, forgetting about the handful of people who had destroyed each other. The ending of the story contains no moral or hidden philosophical message. It is simply a statement of fact. Man is insignificant in the face of the endless, watery desert. The ocean did not kill them quickly in a fair storm. It simply waited. It waited for them to tear each other apart out of fear and despair.